Tale of Oakapple Wood. Mr. Squint meets Rafferty. It was a warm, golden September evening. Old Mr. Squint the mole rose from his armchair and peered through the curtains to look at the woodland outside. He exclaimed. "Just right for me to stretch my legs and go for a little walk." He said this every evening at about the same time. He liked the routine of his quiet life. His house was small, but it was always as clean and tidy as a new pin, with a place for everything, and everything in its place. The flower-patterned curtains fluttered in an autumn breeze, and the little windows gleamed from much polishing. The warm evening sunshine glinted on the brass of the fireplace, and shafts of sunlight danced cheerfully about the room. Mr. Squint always lit a fire in the grate, even in summertime. He had a touch of the rheumatics, and found the warmth most comforting at any time of the year. Most afternoons were spent working at his little cobbler's shop in Oakapple town, absorbed in making and mending shoes and boots for the woodlanders, as they had been for many years. Being a most tidy mole, and very particular about his appearance, he never went out without first adjusting his neckerchief and straightening his waistcoat. After all, one never knew who one was likely to meet in the wood. He loved his evening stroll. He found the sunlight too strong for his tiny eyes during the day, but by evening it was warm and mellow, as the sun disappeared over the brow of Bilberry Hill, leaving a lovely glow over Oakapple Wood. This particular evening he locked his front door, very smart with its new coat of leaf-green paint, and tucked the keys inside his waistcoat pocket. He pondered for a while. Which way tonight? And after a moment's hesitation, set off briskly along the path of the setting sun. The air was cool and clear, and Squint smiled to himself as he sniffed all the wonderful smells of the woodland. He paused for a few minutes at the gate of Lopier's house, from where he could see the rabbit busily digging in his garden. "Evening, Lopier," called Mr. Squint. Lopier looked up and waved to him. "Lovely evening, Mr. Squint," he said. He leaned on his spade and chatted to the old mole, who complimented him on his fragrant honeysuckle. Lopier picked a large bloom and placed it in the mole's buttonhole, which cheered him greatly. After saying good-bye, Squint strolled onwards, surveying the scenery, until he reached the signpost to Oakapple town. He was just about to take the right-hand path when he heard something, or was it someone, move near the signpost. He adjusted his glasses and peered down. Yes, there was somebody there, and what was more, he was snoring. "Well, bless my soul," exclaimed Squint, puzzled. "What a place to sleep!" Half sitting propped up against the post was a dormouse. He was fast asleep and looked very dirty. A battered old hat was over his eyes, and his coat, or what was left of it, was a mass of colourful patches. He had no shoes, and his trousers were full of holes. "Wretched tramps," said Squint, rather more loudly than he had meant, but the dormouse snored on. "Making the place untidy," he muttered. "I think it's disgraceful." He bustled along the path, but as he did so, he tripped over a large pebble and nearly fell into the lap of the sleeping figure. This did disturb the dormouse, who awoke, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He grinned at the annoyed mole. "To be sure, it's a lovely evening," he said with a strange lilt to his voice. Squint noticed that he had 2 front teeth missing, and certainly had not washed lately. "Me name's Rafferty. Pleased to make your acquaintance. Will you be having some tea with me?" He grinned broadly. "Certainly not," retorted Squint, brushing himself down. "I think it's a disgrace. You and your kind think you can take over the entire forest. Haven't you a home to go to?" "To be sure. The whole world's me home," Rafferty replied. "I have the warm grass for a bed and the sky for me roof. Now what else could a poor mouse wish for? apart from a tot of blackcurrant rum now and then. But you must have a home somewhere, said Squint. Everyone has. Not myself, replied Rafferty. Never could abide being in one place too long. Well, you take yourself away from here right now. There will be no welcome in Oakapple Wood for untidy folk like you. Squint was getting very upset now. It had quite spoilt his stroll. Hold on, old man, grinned the mouse. No one tells me when and where to go. I pleases myself. To Squint's great surprise, he began to unpack a rusty kettle and a dented tea caddy from a grubby, checkered tablecloth that he had been using for a pillow. Well, if it's all the same to you, I'm going to have a brew of tea, he smiled. Are you sure you won't join me? Tut, tut, exclaimed the mole, and with a shake of his head and a tug of his neckerchief, he stalked off, frowning. As he picked his way through a tangle of ground ivy and bindweed that grew about the path, he muttered to himself, Wretched fellow, how rude he was. I shall put a stop to his game. It shouldn't be allowed. I know, he thought. I shall go and see Colonel Grunt up at Mayfly Manor. He'll know what to do. Yes, I'll go this very minute. Colonel Grunt was a very old bank vole who was still thought of as head of the council of Oakapple Wood, though he had retired years ago. In fact, he was so old that even some of the other councillors called him Grandpa Grunt, behind his back, of course. He lived at Mayfly Manor with his devoted butler, Tarquin, an elderly shrew, and Clara the cook, Tarquin's wife. If anyone can get that tramp removed, Squint muttered, it's Grunt. He reached the ivy-covered gates of Mayfly Manor, and after stepping over some bramble branches which tugged at his clothes, he pushed them open. With a good deal of squeaking and creaking, they let him through, and he carried on up the pathway to the great door. He ran a paw over his ruffled fur, adjusted his glasses, and rang the bell. After a little while, he heard footsteps in the hall, and the sound of chains being unchained and bolts unbolted. The door slowly opened to reveal the stooping figure of Tarquin. Evening, Tarquin. Is the Colonel in? Squint spoke impatiently, and removed a bramble thorn from his sleeve. Yes, Mr. Squint, sir. Won't you step inside? But Squint was already inside, and brushing past the startled Tarquin. Where is he? In his study? Asked Squint, knocking on the half-open study door as he spoke. He entered the room and addressed the figure sitting in a large armchair before a blazing fire. There was no reply from the Colonel, who was quite plainly asleep. Squint coughed loudly and spoke again, but the old vole went on softly snoring, an ear-trumpet in his lap. The mole then moved forward and gave a polite tug at his sleeve. The Colonel jumped, dropping his ear-trumpet. What the devil, Tarquin? Oh, it's you, Squint, old fella, he said, as he put a monocle to his eye. Well then, my friend, how are you? Squint handed him the ear-trumpet and spoke into it. Louder, man, cried Grunt, rather irritably. You know my ears aren't what they used to be. I want your advice, shouted Squint, and began to tell the Colonel all about Rafferty. He felt quite exhausted by the time he had finished, and had to mop his brow with his handkerchief. Sit down! Sit down! Cried Grunt. Good heavens, man, there's no need to shout. I'm not deaf, you know. Oh, sorry, Colonel, said Squint, and sank gratefully into a cosy armchair. Grunt pulled a bell cord near the fireplace, and after a few minutes Tarquin appeared with 2 glasses of elderberry port on a silver tray. Squint took a glass and sipped it. You say this fella, Rickety, is a tramp, pondered Grunt. A vagabond and a thief as well, I'll be bound. Rafferty, interrupted Squint. and then again louder, "His name's Rafferty."
"That's what I said," replied Grunt, frowning. "No need to shout."
"Well, I thought the Woodland Council could do something about him. There's really no place in this wood for him or his sort."
"What? What's wrong with the port?" Grunt demanded irritably.
No, I said we don't want him or his sort here," replied Squint, getting rather ruffled.
"Agreed,"
said the Colonel, before draining his glass.
"I just don't understand the world today. You know, in my young day—"
"Yes, maybe," interrupted Squint. "But is there some way we can remove this Rafferty from the wood?"
"Well, I shall see the council first thing in the morning, and we'll soon send this rickety fellow packing."
"Rafferty," said Squint.
"Well, that's what I said," frowned the Colonel.
"Perhaps we could get a petition together," suggested Squint, "and get everyone to sign it. Then he'll have to go."
"Oh, you're off now, eh?"
asked Grunt, puzzled. "No, not me. Rafferty!" shouted Squint.
"Oh, yes, rickety, of course. I'll see the council tomorrow about him."
Squint emptied his glass, rose from the chair, and said goodbye. Tarquin was summoned to show him out. Alone again, the old Colonel sat gazing into the firelight.
"Nice chap, that Squint," he reflected. "Pity he shouts."
Squint made his way down the path and out of the gates. He felt quite confident that Grunt and the council would send the tramp on his way. "I've done what I can," he told himself. "But if I meet that Rafferty again, I shall give him a piece of my mind." He did not see the tramp again that evening, and hoped that he had seen the last of him. Soon he reached his little cottage, unlocked the green front door, and stepped inside. How nice it was to be home. Whatever happened in the world outside, he was always glad to come back to his little house. He returned his stick to its place in the umbrella stand in the hall, and entered the living room. He sat down heavily in his old armchair, and looked about him. "Just one chapter of my book, and then I'll be more than ready for bed." He reached for his book and opened it at the place marked with a piece of pressed honeysuckle. After polishing his glasses on his pocket handkerchief, he began reading by the light of the fire. He felt warm and drowsy, and it wasn't long before his eyes slowly closed, and the open book slid to the floor. Soon only the sound of soft snoring filled the little room. Peterkin forgets his paper round. Early next morning, Peterkin Pollensnuff, the wood mouse, hurried along the river bank on his new bicycle. It had been a birthday present from his mother and father, and he was very proud of it. He almost enjoyed his daily paper round now, apart from having to get out of bed so early in the morning. He had a bag of newspapers over his shoulder, and his favourite scarf, knitted for him by Grandma Snuffles, streamed out behind him as he pedalled down the lane. He raced along in the morning sunshine, the bicycle skidding over stones and sliding on fallen leaves. Small insects scurried out of his way in terror. He swerved round a bend far too fast and almost fell off as he tried to avoid crashing into the strange figure that had suddenly appeared before him. "Well, bless my boots! What have we here?" said the figure. Peterkin was quick to notice that the dormouse standing in front of him was not wearing any boots. In fact, the clothes he was wearing were very dirty and needed mending. "Ah, creeping caterpillars!" he gasped. "I didn't see you coming. Top of the morning to you, my lad. Tell me, what's that you've got in your bag?" Peterkin was puzzled. "Oh, they're my newspapers," he said. "Would you like one to read? I think I may have some spare copies. The Daily Twitter's a very good paper. My father always reads it. Oh, I've never understood all that reading and writing stuff, said the tramp. Too much schooling is no good for the likes of me, but I'll take as many as you can spare all the same. But why do you want newspapers if you can't read? Asked Peterkin, astonished. To be sure, you've got a lot to learn, lad, if you want to be a travelling man like old Rafferty when you grow up. Peterkin was not really sure he wanted to become a travelling man, though it did seem to be a lot of fun. Rafferty took a newspaper from the young woodmouse's bag, opened it out, and proceeded to push the pages down his left trouser leg. He then selected another paper, and did the same to the other trouser leg. "There now," he said. "I could have done with those last night. It was cold enough to freeze the nose off a leprechaun." Peterkin giggled. "What's a leprechaun?" "Plenty of those little rascals where I come from," smiled the tramp, showing the gaps in his teeth. "Oh, please, do tell me about them," cried Peterkin, his paper round quite forgotten. This was almost as exciting as his birthday had been. He laid his bicycle on the grass and sat down beside his new-found friend. Rafferty began to build a small fire out of twigs and dry grass, and when it was lit, he placed a rusty kettle over the flame. They both warmed their paws, and the tramp reached for his tea-caddy. "Would you be having some tea with me?" he asked the mouse. "Yes, please," replied the excited Peterkin. "My name's Peterkin Pollensnuff. What's yours?" "I'm Rafferty. Pleased to make your acquaintance, to be sure," he bowed. "I suppose you wouldn't have such a thing as a biscuit on you. It improves the flavour of the tea." Peterkin searched in all his pockets, but could find no biscuits, only a single rosy apple. "Will this do?" he asked. "You can have it. We've got lots at home." "Thank you kindly," said Rafferty, and he bit into the apple hungrily. They talked on about the Emerald Isle, castles and leprechauns, until at last the kettle boiled and Rafferty made the tea. It tasted hot and bitter in the morning air, and Peterkin wrapped his paws around the tin mug for warmth. He couldn't remember when he had enjoyed himself so much. Rafferty told him many stories about all the adventures he had had. He revealed that his parents had stowed away on a merchant ship bound for the Irish coast. They had gone to seek their fortune, but had found that times were hard, especially for dormice in a strange land. However, they had managed to scrape a few shillings together by making and selling walking sticks and clothes pegs, and at the same time they brought up their small son, Rafferty. As they travelled far and wide, sheltering wherever they found a welcome, they taught Rafferty all he needed to know about living off the land. When the time was right, Rafferty said farewell and returned to England, and had been roving the countryside ever since. It all sounded so exciting that for a while Peterkin lost all sense of time. Suddenly he remembered school. He jumped up. "What time is it?" he cried. "Oh, no good asking me that," chuckled Rafferty. "Time is just day and night to me. I get up when Mr. Sun tickles me nose and go to sleep when I see the man in the moon." "Goodness, it must be very late," cried Peterkin. "I have to go now." He picked up the bicycle and slung his bag over his shoulder. "Will you still be here when I come home from school?" he asked. The tramp scratched his head thoughtfully as he drained the last of the tea from the tin mug. "Well, I might," he said, grinning. "And then again I might not. It all depends on what sort of a day this turns out to be." "How do you mean?" asked Peterkin. "Well, today might be a travelling day, or there again, it might be a staying in one place day." "Oh, I do hope it's a staying in one place day," cried Peterkin. "I want to hear some more stories." "We'll see," said Rafferty, winking. The woodmouse leapt onto his bicycle. "Bye!" he shouted. "See you after school. Take care, you young scallywag." The tramp waved his tin mug in the air as the mouse rode away. Peterkin's mind was racing, and he nearly rode into a bramble bush in his haste. Very soon he reached the path outside Pollensnuff's stores, where he lived with his mother and father, baby William, and the twins Pippin and Amy. He leant his bicycle against the wall and pushed open the door. The bell clanged loudly, and Mrs. Pollensnuff looked up from the counter. "Why, Peterkin, where have you been? You'll be late for school," she said. "Gosh, Mother," began Peterkin excitedly. "I've met a real tramp, and he told me all about his adventures, and then—" "Hold on," said his mother. "Don't talk so fast. You better go and wash your face and paws and fetch your satchel, or you won't get there in time. But no more talk," she said. "Go and get ready for school. Oh, now look, William's crying." She went through to the back of the shop and picked up the baby mouse, who was wailing loudly and kicking his legs. "There, there," she said. "Hush now." And with another glance at Peterkin, "Come on, son, hurry up." Peterkin ran upstairs to collect his satchel. He decided there was simply no time to wash, and anyway, Rafferty never bothered, did he? Flying down the stairs again, he ran straight into Mr. Pollensnuff. "Oh, Father, you'll never believe what happened to me this morning." "Come on, Peterkin, you're late for school. You'll have to hurry. Off you go now." "Oh, dear," thought Peterkin. "Nobody wants to know about Rafferty and all the fun I've had this morning. I bet everyone at school will envy me when I tell them, especially Verity Twitcher." He did not care very much for Verity. She was always trying to tease him. The shop door banged behind him as he ran to his bicycle, jumped onto the saddle, and rode off in the direction of Oakapple School. "I wonder what Rafferty's doing now," he said to himself as he pedalled along. Back at the stores, Mrs. Pollensnuff was still trying to quieten the crying William. "What was young Peterkin chattering about?" Mr. Pollensnuff asked her as he stacked some tins on a shelf. "Oh, I don't know. Something about a tramp," she said, putting William back in his cot behind the counter. "Daydreaming again, I expect." "I hope so," replied Mr. Pollensnuff. "Folks won't take too kindly to strangers in the woodland." The home-baked loaves he was piling on the counter were still warm and smelled wonderful. Suddenly, there was a loud thump from upstairs. "Whatever's that?" he wondered. The sound of squeaking followed the thump. "I'll go," said his wife. "I expect the twins are awake." She hurried up the stairs and pushed open the door to the twins' room. She was immediately hit on the nose by a flying pillow. "You naughty pair, what have you been up to?" she demanded of the two little mice who were standing knee-high in feathers. "Pick up your pillows and go and get dressed before your father sees you," she said. They scurried about, squeaking and arguing, while their mother looked on sternly. "If this room isn't cleared up in 5 minutes, there'll be no breakfast for either of you," she warned as she went downstairs to her wailing baby. When she returned to the counter, she found her husband talking to Mrs. Twitcher. "Good morning, Mrs. Twitcher," she said. "How are you today?"
"I'm quite well, Mrs. Pollensnuff, apart from my poor old feet, you know. I was just saying to Mr. Pollensnuff, that lad of yours didn't deliver my paper this morning, and I've had to walk all the way from Harebill Heath to collect it."
"Oh, dear," thought Mrs. Pollensnuff. "What has Peterkin been up to now?" Mrs. Twitcher picked up her paper and bought some coltsfoot tobacco to take back to Grandpa Twitcher.
"I've heard talk of strangers in the forest,"
she gossiped, putting the things into her basket.
"Grandma Snuffles told me she saw a group of weasels the other day. Up to no good, I dare say."
"Yes," said Mr. Pollensnuff. "Young Peterkin said something about a tramp this morning."
"Well, you tell him not to talk to strangers," said the old vole. "Their ways aren't the same as ours."
"We certainly will," said Mrs. Pollensnuff. Mrs. Twitcher picked up her basket, said her goodbyes, and went out into the morning sunshine. Mr. Squint's Bad Day. The early morning sun, streaming through his bedroom window, had woken Mr. Squint. After making his first cup of blackberry leaf tea, he looked around for his copy of the Daily Twitter. It had not been on the doormat as usual, so Squint opened the front door, blinking in the strong sunlight, and peered at the letterbox. There was no sign of the paper anywhere. He shut the door impatiently. "That young rascal of a paper boy has forgotten me," he said to himself. "Now I shall have to go and collect it from the shop. This really isn't good enough." He tried to settle down in his armchair with his tea, steaming and scented, in the little china cup, which he sipped irritably. It had upset his routine. He always read the paper with his morning tea. It didn't feel right without it. Today had begun badly. Still, it did seem to be a lovely morning outside, and if he kept in the shade, he might rather enjoy the walk to Pollensnuff stores. He rose from his chair and went over to the little window. Opening it, he sniffed at the air. It was full of wonderful autumnal smells. Bramble, elderberry, and hawthorn were abundant, and the wood resounded with the songs of thrush and blackbird. "Ah, well," he thought, "perhaps today is not quite so bad after all." He finished his tea and set about washing and dressing. After checking himself in his bedroom mirror to make sure everything was just so, he reached for his cap. It was a very gay affair, black and tan-checked, and Squint had wondered when he had bought it if it were perhaps a little too adventurous for a mole of his age. Grandma Snuffles had been with him at the time and had urged him to buy it. "It suits you a treat, Master Squint," she had said. He was never quite sure why she always called him Master Squint, but was too polite to correct her. He supposed it was because she was one of the oldest hedgehogs in the wood, and still looked upon him as a youngster. He decided to wear the cap. Besides, it would help to keep the sun out of his eyes. He fetched his stick, locked the little front door securely behind him, pulled his cap down at a jaunty angle, and strolled off along the road to Pollensnuff stores. The air was sweet, with just the hint of a chill, and Squint was glad he had put on his warmest muffler. He hummed to himself as he strode along. The sky was very blue, and the tops of the tall oaks swayed in the gentle breeze. Fallen leaves made a huge, crunchy carpet for him to walk on. Before long, he came to the river bank, and was nearly dazzled by a dragonfly which hovered for a moment in front of him, with wings glinting in the sun's rays. Squint blinked and felt quite dizzy. "Confounded creatures," he muttered. They were always playing tricks on him. "Hello, Squint, old friend," called a voice. "Lovely morning." The mole blinked again in the sunlight, and tried to make out the figure before him. "Oh, good morning, Hopfellow," he said as he recognized his friend. "What brings you out so early?" asked the frog. He was carrying a fishing rod over his shoulder, and there was a basket at his feet. "I'm just on my way to the stores," said Squint. "Wretched paper boy forgot to deliver my paper this morning." "That's funny," said Hopfellow. "He forgot mine as well. I'll walk with you." "I don't know what the woodland's coming to," complained the mole. "No one believes in a proper routine any more." Hopfellow picked up his basket. "Had any luck this morning?" asked Squint, peering into it. "I managed to catch a few little wrigglers," replied Hopfellow. "Would you like a cup of your tea?" "No, thank you," answered Squint, wrinkling his nose. He had always thought fish rather smelly creatures. They set off down the little path on their way to town. Every now and then, Hopfellow would go on ahead and hold back a branch or bramble for Squint to pass through, while Squint told him about his encounter with the tramp the previous evening. "It was most unfortunate," he said. The beautiful morning had mellowed his anger, and things didn't seem quite so bad now.
Well, I expect he's gone on his way now, suggested Hopfellow. You probably frightened him off.
Squint agreed wholeheartedly.
I certainly sent him off with a flea in his ear. Probably saved the council a job.
He hoped he had seen the last of Rafferty. As they climbed the old oak stile, they heard voices. Grandma Snuffles the hedgehog and Mrs. Twitcher the vole were busy gathering elderberries and rosehips. Grandma Snuffles had a long walking stick which she was using to reach the higher branches.
Good morning, ladies, called Hopfellow. You're both up early. What are you doing? Good day to you, Hopfellow, and to you, Master Squint, said Grandma. We're going to make rosehip syrup and some of my special wine. The fruit must be picked while the morning sunshine is still warming them, or they'll be no good to anyone. Perhaps we may sample your wine when it is ready. What, Squint, what? Suggested the frog, winking at Squint. Oh, yes, please, the mole said, smiling. Not too much for you, Master Squint, chuckled Grandma Snuffles. We don't want you getting tipsy, do we, Mrs. Twitcher? Everyone laughed, and Squint blushed under his grey fur. Oh, my poor feet, exclaimed Mrs. Twitcher. I've walked such a long way this morning, I must sit down for a moment. She sat down amongst the baskets of rosehips, stretched out her legs, revealing long, lacy pantaloons, and began rubbing her feet. My rheumatics are terrible today, she informed everyone. Squint had never seen a lady's pantaloons before, and he blushed again. We must be on our way, Hopfellow, he stammered, taking him by the arm. Farewell then, ladies. Happy gathering, said the frog, as he and the mole continued their journey. By the time they reached Pollensnuff's stalls, they were glowing after their long walk. The whole woodland was awake and enjoying the new day. As Squint and Hopfellow pushed open the shop door and went inside, they were nearly knocked over by two little mice who were shouting and chasing each other. Squint frowned at them disapprovingly, but they only giggled and scurried away. You naughty mice! I'm so sorry, gentlemen, said a rather tired-looking Mrs. Pollensnuff. No harm done, smiled Hopfellow. We've both come for our newspapers, Mrs. Pollensnuff. Oh, dear, you're the third already. I really don't know what that boy's been up to this morning, wasting time talking to tramps. I'll see it doesn't happen again. At that, Squint looked alarmed. So, Rafferty was still in the wood. He started to feel angry all over again. Must be that fellow Rafferty you were telling me about, said Hopfellow, turning to the mole. I thought you had sent him on his way. Seems like we'll have to call in the council after all. Squint blushed for the third time that morning. This really wasn't such a good day. Mrs. Pollensnuff was trying to stop William from crawling inside an empty tea chest, and so they collected their newspapers and, with a last farewell, left. Hopfellow went to buy some new hooks for his fishing line, and Squint went into the watchmender's to see if his pocket watch was ready. It was not, so he arranged to collect it the next day. I'll walk with you to the river bank, said the frog, as they met up again for the journey homewards. So off they set once more into the wood. And as they walked, they saw the two little mice trying to shoot down crab-apples from a tree with a large catapult. Their mother has her paws full looking after her family, Hopfellow remarked. Squint peered over his glasses, frowning, and only grunted. They walked on, chatting together, until they reached the stile. There they found Mrs. Twitcher and Grandma Snuffles sitting on the grass, drinking tea. Won't you join us, dears? Asked Grandma, raising her cup. We're just having a little rest. "No, thank you kindly," said the mole. He never did agree with eating or drinking in the middle of the morning. "I must be on my way."
"Well, I'll accept your kind offer, Grandma. Do you mind, Squint, old friend?" asked Oddfellow, sitting himself down on the grass beside Mrs. Twitcher.
"Not at all," Squint smiled. "Good day to you all."
He waved his stick in the air.
"Goodbye. If you hurry, you may catch up with the tram," called Mrs. Twitcher.
The mole spun round, frowning.
"Tramp?" he exclaimed. "Do you mean you've seen him this morning?" "Why, yes," replied Mrs. Twitcher, chuckling. "He had some tea with us, didn't he, Grandma?"
She winked at Grandma Snuffles, and the old hedgehog grinned.
"Such a charming fellow," she said, "although he did look in need of a good bath and a change of clothes. He told us some wonderful tales." "You'd have done better to send him on his way," said Squint, now very annoyed. "If I catch him again, I'll teach him to go about the woodland bothering folks." "Oh, but he really was quite charming," said Mrs. Twitcher. "He said how much he liked my hat. Didn't he, Grandma?"
The hedgehog nodded in agreement.
"That's as maybe," grumbled Squint. "But I'd advise you all to lock your doors. I don't trust his sort."
He said goodbye again and stalked off, nearly treading on a large green beetle in his haste. He paused by the river bank and looked about him. There was nobody else around. He wondered where the tramp had disappeared to. He was so angry he felt ready to challenge him and run him out of Oakapple Wood. But there was no sign of Rafferty anywhere. Squint went on his way and soon came to his own front door.
"I hope Colonel Grunt hasn't forgotten to tell the Woodland Council,"
he thought, as he fumbled for his keys, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. He put his stick back in the umbrella stand and took off the cap. He opened the door. It's bloody carpet. He hit them for a time. He looked around. Nothing more fell his nose with surprise. The room seemed to have been turned upside down. The door opened and pulled out, and their contents spilled all over the floor. The table had been knocked over, and his armchair was lying on its side. It was a little while before he realized that his treasured silver candlesticks were missing from the shelf. They had been left to him by his great-aunt Hepzibah, and were most valuable.
"Oh, dear! Oh, dear!"
mumbled Squint, feeling quite dazed. He felt his way over to the chair, picked it up, and sat down heavily in it.
"Robbery! Who would have imagined such a thing?"
He sat for a few moments, looking around the room and trying to collect his thoughts. Suddenly he jumped up with such force that the chair fell over again.
"Rafferty! That devil has robbed me of my candlesticks. But how could he have got in? I locked the door as usual."
As he stood there getting angrier and angrier, he noticed the patterned curtains fluttering in the breeze of the open window. Of course! He had opened it himself that very morning, and he had forgotten to close it. How unlike him! It was most upsetting. He went to close it and tripped over the table leg. He searched about the floor for his glasses and replaced them on his nose. Then he put everything back in the drawers and turned the table over in an effort to put his little room in order.
"Well, this is a job for the police," he declared out loud. "I shall go to the police station and give them a full description of Rafferty. They'll soon have that vagabond behind bars, and I shall have my candlesticks back."
He marched out of the room and into the hall. Picking up his stick, he opened the green front door once again and went out into the wood, heading straight for Oakapple Police Station. The Capture. At the police station, Squint gave details of the robbery to Sergeant Quilp, a rather gruff and elderly toad. He was Hopfellow's cousin.
Yes, said Quilp, scratching his head. You say this Rafferty fellow may still be in the woods?
Why, yes, said Squint impatiently. If we hurry, we can catch the scoundrel red-handed with my candlesticks.
That's if he is the thief, warned Quilp.
Oh, tut, muttered Squint. Of course he is. Who else could it possibly be?
Well, I've had several reports of strangers being seen in the woodland, and of things mysteriously disappearing from folks' houses. Only last week old Grandpa Twitcher lost his silver tobacco tin.
But it must be Rafferty, insisted Squint. I feel it in my bones. His bones at that moment felt rather tired after all the exercise, and he reflected sadly that if this whole tiresome business had not happened, he could have been toasting his toes in front of a blazing fire and reading his newspaper. Quilp put away his pen and notebook and reached for his police helmet.
We'd better see if we can find this tramp of yours, he said, as he tucked a large truncheon into his belt.
He had never had to use it, but it did make him look rather fearsome.
Come on, Squint, I shall need your help.
They went out into the wood together in search of Rafferty, Quilp striding ahead, and a rather weary Squint hurrying and scurrying to keep up with him. That same afternoon, Peterkin was cycling across Harebell Heath after school. He pedalled slowly and looked about for signs of the tramp. Perhaps he decided today was a travelling day after all, he thought disappointedly. He came to the signpost and stopped for a moment, looking around him. He was just about to cycle off towards home when he heard a strange voice singing from behind the brambles. He pricked up his ears. It was Rafferty's voice.
I cares for nobody, no, not I, and nobody cares for me, he sang.
Peterkin left his bicycle by the signpost and rushed through the thorny branches until he came to the clearing. There sat the tramp, warming his feet by a little fire. Beside him was a checkered tablecloth tied into a bundle. "Creeping caterpillars! I thought you'd gone away!" exclaimed Peterkin.
Hello there, young scallywag, grinned Rafferty. Sit down, and share me fire.
Peterkin sat down by the small fire, which crackled and spat at him. "What have you been doing all day?" he asked, throwing a twig into the flames.
"Oh, a bit of this and a bit of that," replied Rafferty. "In fact, I've had what you might call a most interesting day."
Peterkin's eyes lit up. "What's happened?" Rafferty placed the rusty kettle on the fire and looked about him. He moved closer to Peterkin and whispered in the mouse's ear. "Keep very quiet," he said, "and take a look at these." He picked up the bundle and untied the clumsy knots. The astonished Peterkin could hardly believe his eyes. In the folds of the tablecloth lay several shiny objects. "Phew! Creeping caterpillars! Where did you get that lot?" he asked. "You didn't steal them, did you?" Rafferty stood up indignantly.
Old Rafferty may be a tramp, but a thief he most certainly is not, he fumed. I thought you were my friend.
The bundle fell wide open, revealing more things, including a pair of silver candlesticks. Rafferty bent down and began roughly throwing the things back into the tablecloth. "Oh, I'm sure you're not really a thief," exclaimed Peterkin, trying to calm the tramp. "But where did you find these things? There's Grandpa Twitcher's tobacco tin, and I'm sure I've seen those candlesticks on Mr. Squint's shelf."
You mean you recognize these things? Asked the tramp, still rather annoyed.
He stuck his nose in the air and tried to straighten his battered hat.
Well, it's jolly lucky for some folks around here that I happened along, he announced smugly.
"Why?" Peterkin persisted. What's happened to you today?" Rafferty sat down again. "Well," he said at last, and his voice lowered to a whisper, "there was I, just strolling along in the wood, minding my own business, you know, looking for the odd black relief in my teapot." Rafferty paused to take the steaming kettle off the fire. "Well, go on," said Peterkin impatiently. "Well, as I said, there was I just strolling along, when I heard voices behind an old oak tree." He poured the boiling water into the teapot. "Many strange voices," he said mysteriously. "Go on," urged Peterkin. He was nearly bursting with curiosity. Rafferty stirred the tea with a twig. "I crept up behind the tree to listen. I thought whoever it was might just invite me to dinner, if they were friendly folks." He poured the steaming tea into 2 tin mugs and handed one to Peterkin. "There was about 6 or 7 of them," he said. "Who?" demanded Peterkin loudly. "Hush," said Rafferty. "Weasels, and from the sound of them, they were up to no good." He lowered his voice again. "They were talking and laughing, and some of them had neckerchiefs over their noses like masks." "Gosh," breathed Peterkin. "What did you do?" The tramp took a sip of tea. It was very hot, and he spilled a few drops. "I just sat very still and watched them for a bit," he said, wiping his whiskers on his sleeve. "They were all sitting in a circle around these." He pointed to the bundle of goods. "Every now and then one of them would pick up something from the pile, polish it on his sleeve, and laugh at the others. Well, it was plain to me that they had stolen all this stuff from innocent folks. I couldn't think what to do, but then I had an idea." He tapped the side of his hat and smiled toothlessly at Peterkin. "It was then that old Rafferty used his cunning." "How?" asked the mouse. "I remember an old trick my father once taught me." Rafferty cleared his throat and started to make a strange noise, just like a hungry dog-fox on the prowl. "Oh! Oh!" That made 'em jump in their waistcoats, he grinned. They all leapt up and looked around. I stood up and started to run, crying, "Fox! Help! Fox! It's a fox! Come and help! Help! It's a fox!" "You never saw such a shindig," he chuckled. They pushed each other out of the way and ran in all directions. A couple ran behind the tree and crashed into another who had managed to grab some trinkets and stuff them down in front of his waistcoat. All 3 of them rolled into a blackberry bush, scattering rings and bracelets as they went. There was a great deal of squeaking, I can tell you. Rafferty sniggered. Then one of them's, the ringleader, I think, a nasty-looking rascal with a black patch over one eye, come rushing straight for me. I dodged out of the way, and he tripped over a coal scuttle and went sprawling into a large bed of nettles. You could have heard him squeak from here to Bluebear Wood as he got stung all over. Laughing out loud and rubbing his paws together with glee, Rafferty continued. As soon as the coast seemed clear, up I jumps and made off with their spoils. I didn't stop running till I reached this thicket. They'll never find me now. Phew, said Peterkin. You are brave. Oh, it's surprising what you learn when you make your living on the road, said Rafferty, now very pleased with himself. But what are you going to do with all this now? Asked Peterkin, picking up a shiny ring from the bundle. It glittered in the sunlight, making him blink. Well, I was hoping you could help, said the tramp. Me? Said Peterkin. Oh, you mean you want me to show you where the police station is? Well, no, not exactly, answered Rafferty slowly. Policemen don't take too kindly to us tramps, you see. Besides, there are some folks hereabouts who will think I've stolen their valuables. Maybe we could, return the things without anyone finding out. I don't want to run into that pack of weasels. But you must go to the police, insisted Peterkin. We'll go and see Sergeant Quilp and tell him the whole story. These weasels must be caught before they do any more stealing."
"Well, I'm sure I don't know," muttered Rafferty, scratching his neck.
"But when they find out, everyone will see what a hero you've been," said Peterkin, gathering up the bundle.
"Oh, now do you really think so?" said Rafferty.
He stopped scratching and thought about this. Himself a hero. Well, it might do him a bit of good, and would certainly show that miserable old mole he had met the previous evening. "Come on," urged Peterkin. "We'll go right away." They emptied their tin mugs and hurriedly put out the fire. Collecting the stolen goods together, they made their way through the brambles and onto the road. They had not gone far when they noticed two figures hurrying towards them. One was several paces in front of the other, who was puffing and trying to keep up with his companion. It was Mr. Squint and Sergeant Quilp.
"There he is,"
shouted Squint excitedly, pointing at Rafferty.
"and with my candlesticks. Quick, arrest him, Quilp."
Peterkin and Rafferty stood still and stared in amazement as the mole rushed towards them, waving his stick.
"Hold on, Squint. I'll deal with this if you don't mind," said Quilp sternly.
"But you can see he's a thief. Look, he's got my candlesticks."
Squint persisted, jumping up and down excitedly.
"Oh, they're yours, are they?" retorted Rafferty. "If I'd have known that, I'd have left them for the weasels."
"You scoundrel, give them to me,"
demanded Squint, knocking Rafferty's hat over his eyes as he made a grab for the candlesticks.
"No. Order, please, gentlemen," said Quilp, trying to stop the tramp from pulling Squint's long pink nose. "Whatever are you doing here, Peterkin?" he asked.
"Oh, Sergeant Quilp, it's all a terrible mistake. Mr. Rafferty didn't steal those things. Well, not exactly, anyhow," he added. "He was just coming to see you."
"Ha!" muttered Squint disbelievingly. "I think we'd all better go back to the station and have a little talk," said Quilp, catching hold of Rafferty by his ragged coat collar. "You too, Peterkin, my lad? I can't imagine what your father's going to say."
Squint had managed to get the candlesticks away from the tramp, and was inspecting them closely and polishing them now and then with his pocket handkerchief.
"Come on, Squint, you too," called Quilp.
They made a strange spectacle as they walked down the road towards the police station. Sergeant Quilp marched between Peterkin and Rafferty, who both looked very unhappy. Somehow their good deed had all gone wrong. Squint followed them, keeping his distance and clutching the silver candlesticks to his plump stomach. When they reached the station, Rafferty was put into a cell with a large padlock on the door. He sighed.
"Oh, what muddle have you got yourself into now, Rafferty, old feller?" he asked himself. "I should have made this a travelling day after all. No one will believe the likes of me."
He sat down on the hard bed, pushed his battered hat over his eyes, and tried to snooze. In his office, Quilp listened intently to Peterkin's story.
He said, scratching his chin thoughtfully. "I suppose we'd better try to find this band of weasels, if in fact they do exist. But I think that tramp is just a wily old robber."
Quilp got up and left the room, and Peterkin could hear him calling together his other officers to form a search party. Mr. Squint and Peterkin sat on the old wooden bench together to wait for news. The mole tapped his stick on the floor impatiently and frowned at Peterkin over his glasses. What a to-do! Whoever would have thought such a thing could happen in Oakapple Wood? Peterkin sighed wearily and thought of the telling off he would be getting when he returned home. Meanwhile, in Bramble Copse, Quilp and his men were busily searching the undergrowth for possible clues. Quilp made them all crawl along under the brambles, and every now and then someone would yell as they were scratched by the thorny branches. "Shh," warned Quilp. "Be quiet." They were about to move on when a strange creature suddenly appeared in the clearing. Quilp and his officers could hardly believe their eyes and stayed cowering under the brambles. The creature was squealing loudly and running round and round in circles, and appeared to be wearing some sort of hat which completely covered his head. Every so often it would trip over a stone or tree root and be sent sprawling and squealing into the grass with a loud clang as the hat hit a nearby tree. Quilp, who had never seen anything like it before, crept forward through the dense undergrowth to get a better look. His officers whispered together and struggled to find their truncheons. Quilp angrily signalled to them to be quiet while he watched the creature. Clang! It had fallen down again, and was trying to untangle itself from some bindweed that was wrapped around its feet. Quilp took his chance. He charged out of the brambles, brandishing his truncheon menacingly. "Don't move!" he growled. But the poor creature couldn't. "Quick, men! Grab it now!" The police officers surrounded it and pinned it to the ground. Then they all began laughing. The strange creature was none other than a very angry weasel with a coal scuttle stuck fast over his head. He kicked his feet and cursed loudly at them, but try as they might, not one could get the coal scuttle off. It just would not budge.
"Take him to the station,"
Quilp ordered 2 of his men. So the weasel was marched off, still wearing the scuttle and squeaking angrily. A loud commotion made them turn their heads to see another of the weasel band trapped by his braces and hanging from a branch of an elder tree. Several trinkets lay on the ground around him, and his pockets bulged with more. He hissed and cursed, but was quite relieved to be freed at last from the tree, from which he told them he had been hanging for some hours and was very hungry. He was muttering about a certain wretched dormouse, who he assured them he would wrap in stinging nettles and roast alive if he ever saw him again. Quilp grinned to himself. So Rafferty's story was true after all. Just fancy that. Back in the copse, a frantic chase was going on. 2 of Quilp's men were in hot pursuit of 3 more weasels who were dodging in and out of the prickly branches, getting badly scratched. As they rounded a large oak, the officers moved in on the weasels, and they all collided, falling down in a huge squirming heap and showering the grass around them with rings, brooches, and bangles. The weasels were just too tired to fight back any more, and sat there rubbing their stinging faces and scratched legs. Their leader, the one with the black eye patch that Rafferty had told Peterkin about, grudgingly told Quilp that they had been fighting amongst themselves over the stolen goods after an untidy, smelly dormouse had frightened them into believing a fox was hunting them. He curled his lips menacingly. "If I set eyes on him again, I shall cover him with treacle and put him in a wasp's nest," he snarled.
"Come along, you 3 rascals,"
said Quilp, as they were securely handcuffed and pulled to their feet.
"It's time you were paying a little visit to Oakapple Wood Police Station."
Rafferty's Party. Some time later, Rafferty was awakened by an uproar outside his cell. He sat up, pricking his ears. Could he be dreaming? Surely he could hear the squeaks of weasel tongues. He put his nose through the bars of the cell. Outside, several wicked-looking weasels were being hustled along by Quilp and his men. They were brought into the police station, bruised and scratched, and looking very dejected. As they protested loudly and argued amongst themselves, Sergeant Quilp deftly removed rings, bracelets, watches, and even a small shiny teapot from their waistcoat pockets. Squint's glasses fell off his nose in astonishment as he watched open-mouthed with Peterkin. The young woodmouse turned to him triumphantly. "I told you Rafferty was innocent, Mr. Squint," he said. "He was going to give all those things back to their owners." Squint felt very humble. He fumbled for his glasses and replaced them on his nose. "Well, bless my soul," was all he could say. The weasel gang were taken to a large cell and locked inside. One was still wearing his coal scuttle. No one could remove it, and Quilp had sent one of his officers to buy a pound of best butter from Pollensnuff stores to see if that could do the trick. It wasn't long before the weasels started to bicker once more, and two of them began to fight, still handcuffed together. Weasel fists flew in all directions as they fought and tried to bite each other. Clang went the coal scuttle against the prison bars. Suddenly, one of them, the leader with the black eye patch, recognized Rafferty in the next cell.
"There he is," he screeched. "Just wait till I get my fangs into you."
He beat at the bars, and the others hissed in a terrifying way and shook their paws at him.
"Not much chance of that," Sergeant Quilp told them. "You're going to be here for quite some time."
He unlocked the door of Rafferty's cell.
"It seems we all owe you an apology, Mr. Rafferty," he said, looking over his shoulder at Squint. The mole felt very small and stared at the floor. Quilp held open the cell door. "You are free to go wherever you want, but I should think there are a few folks around here who will want to thank you personally for the return of their valuables."
Rafferty grinned. "Glad to be of service, to be sure." And Peterkin clapped his paws together. "Hooray for Mr. Rafferty!" he cried. Poor old Mr. Squint fumbled with his cap and moved over to the tramp. He cleared his throat noisily. Mr. Rafferty, would you do me the honour of taking tea with me at my house? You too, Peterkin," he added, turning to the young mouse. Rafferty smiled broadly. "Well, that'd be a rare treat. Thank you kindly, Mr. Squincer." So off they went, arm in arm, out of the police station, where the weasels were still making a din and demanding their tea. Peterkin ran close behind Mr. Squint and Rafferty, carefully carrying the silver candlesticks. Quilp took off his helmet and scratched his head. "Well, who would have believed it?" he muttered as he watched them go. Once back at Mr. Squint's house,